The Victorian era was known for its elaborate mourning rituals. Death was not just an end, but a solemn ceremony, meticulously documented for posterity. Such was the custom in 1896 when photography had become an established art form, yet still retained an air of mystery, a way to capture souls in silver and light. In the attic of the old Blackwood estate, dust motes danced in the thin shafts of afternoon sunlight that managed to penetrate the grime-covered windows. The house had stood empty for decades, its last owner having passed away 3 months prior, leaving the property to a distant relative who had no interest in keeping it. The estate sale was scheduled for tomorrow, and Emma Clark, a 32-year-old photography conservator, had been hired to catalog and appraise the various photographs found throughout the house. Emma moved methodically through the attic, her gloved hands carefully sorting through stacks of cabinet cards, cartes de visite, and daguerreotypes. The Blackwood family had been meticulous about documenting their lives, leaving behind a visual chronicle spanning generations. "Find anything interesting?" The voice from the attic stairs made Emma jump slightly. "Thomas, you startled me," she said, recognizing her assistant, a graduate student in historical preservation. "Sorry," he replied, setting down a box of archival materials. "The realtor said we have until sunset before we need to clear out. That gives us about 3 more hours. Emma nodded, turning back to the collection. "Most of what I've found is fairly standard for a family of their standing. Portraits, wedding photos, vacation mementos." She trailed off as her fingers brushed against a larger format photograph housed in an ornate black frame, partially wrapped in crumbling tissue paper. She carefully removed the protective covering, revealing a post-mortem photograph. This wasn't unusual for the era. Death photography had been common practice, a way for families to have a final image of their loved ones. This particular photograph showed a funeral scene, a closed casket draped with flowers, mourners dressed in black, and at the center a woman in an elaborate mourning dress with a heavy black veil obscuring her face completely. "Another funeral photo," Thomas commented, peering over Emma's shoulder. They were certainly fond of memento mori. Emma didn't respond immediately. Something about this particular photograph held her attention. The composition was standard for the time, but there was a tension in the scene that felt almost palpable. The mourners stood stiffly, their faces solemn but somehow uncomfortable, and the widow, centrally positioned beside the casket, seemed to command the frame despite her face being hidden behind the thick veil. "This one's different," Emma finally said, carefully turning the frame over. On the back was a small brass plate with an inscription, "Blackwood Funeral, September 18th, 1896. "Tomorrow's the anniversary," Thomas remarked. 129 years to the day. Emma nodded absently, still studying the photograph. "I want to take a closer look at this one in the lab. There's something about the composition that's unusual." Thomas checked his watch. "We should start packing up if you want to make it back to the lab today." Emma carefully wrapped the photograph in acid-free tissue paper and placed it in her specialized carrying case. They spent the next hour boxing up the remaining photographs, most of which would go to the local historical society as stipulated in the will. As they loaded the last of the boxes into Emma's van, the realtor, Mrs. Winters, approached them. "Find anything of value?" she asked, keys jingling in her hand. "Historically speaking, yes," Emma replied. "The Blackwood collection provides an excellent visual record of upper-middle-class life in the late 19th century. Monetarily, most of the photographs would fetch modest prices at auction, but nothing extraordinary." Mrs. Winters nodded, clearly more interested in the potential sale of the house than its photographic history. "Well, I'm glad someone appreciates these old pictures. Most potential buyers just see them as creepy reminders of the past. History isn't always comfortable," Emma said, "but it's always valuable." She thanked the realtor and climbed into her van, the funeral photograph safely stored in the case beside her. The conservation lab at Westfield University was empty when Emma arrived. The autumn semester had just begun, and students wouldn't start their practical work until next week. This suited Emma perfectly. She preferred the solitude of the lab when examining new acquisitions. She set up her workstation meticulously, arranging her tools and turning on the specialized lighting. With careful hands, she removed the funeral photograph from its frame, noting that it hadn't been opened since it was originally framed. The photograph itself was a silver gelatin print, common for 1896, and was in remarkably good condition, protected from light and air by the sealed frame. Emma placed the photograph under the digital microscope connected to her computer and began to scan it at high resolution. The level of detail preserved in these old photographs always amazed her. The textures of the fabrics, the subtle expressions, the small objects that people chose to include in the frame. She zoomed in on the mourners first, studying their faces. There were 12 people besides the veiled widow, arranged in a semicircle around the casket. Their expressions ranged from appropriately somber to what appeared to be thinly veiled anxiety. One man, standing slightly apart from the others, looked directly at the camera with what Emma could only describe as fear in his eyes. "What were you afraid of?" Emma murmured, making a note to research the identities of the mourners later. Next, she moved to the casket itself. It was an expensive model, with ornate silver handles and fine woodwork visible even through the draping of funeral flowers. Lilies, roses, and chrysanthemums, all traditional funeral flowers of the era, covered much of the casket. But there, partially hidden by a spray of lilies, was something unusual, what appeared to be a small lock on the side of the casket. "That's odd," Emma said to herself. Caskets of the period weren't typically locked. She made another note to research this detail. Finally, she turned her attention to the central figure, the widow. The mourning dress was elaborate even by Victorian standards, with layers of black crepe and silk. The veil was particularly heavy, completely obscuring any hint of the face beneath. The widow's gloved hands were clasped before her, holding what appeared to be a prayer book or small Bible. Emma adjusted the settings on her imaging software, enhancing the contrast to better see the details of the veil. As the software processed the image, Emma's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. "Thomas." "Hey, what's up?" she answered. "Just checking if you made it to the lab okay," Thomas replied, "and to see if that funeral photo revealed any secrets." Emma laughed. "I just started examining it. No earth-shattering revelations yet, but there are some unusual elements. I'll tell you about them tomorrow. You're not staying late, are you? You know how the dean feels about after-hours work in the lab. I'll be out by 8, I promise," Emma said. "I just want to finish the initial scan and enhancement." After hanging up, Emma returned to her computer where the enhanced image had finished processing. She zoomed in on the veil, adjusting the levels to penetrate the darkness of the black fabric, and then she saw it. Behind the veil, faintly visible through the enhanced contrast, was not the downturned face of a grieving widow, but a smile, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched across the entire visible portion of the face. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She adjusted the settings again, convinced she was seeing a processing artifact or a trick of the light. But with each adjustment, the smile became more distinct. There was no mistaking it. Beneath the solemn veil of mourning, the widow was smiling broadly. "That can't be right," Emma muttered, running a hand through her hair. In Victorian funeral photography, expressions were invariably solemn. Smiling would have been considered deeply inappropriate, especially for a widow at her husband's funeral. She saved the enhanced image and continued her examination, zooming in on the widow's hands. The prayer book was held at an odd angle, and upon enhancement, Emma could see that it wasn't a prayer book at all, but what appeared to be a small journal or notebook. The clock on the wall showed 7:45 p.m. Emma reluctantly began to pack up her equipment, knowing she needed to leave the lab soon. She carefully returned the photograph to its frame, making sure to document its condition before and after examination as per conservation protocols. As she drove home to her apartment on the outskirts of town, her mind kept returning to that smile behind the veil. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps it was a photographic anomaly, or maybe, though it seemed far-fetched, the widow had suffered some kind of psychological break due to grief. Emma's apartment was a small but comfortable space filled with books on photography, history, and art. The walls were decorated with reproductions of famous photographs and a few original prints she had collected over the years. She dropped her bag by the door and headed straight for her personal library, pulling out several volumes on Victorian funeral customs and post-mortem photography. She spent the next few hours researching, but found nothing to explain the smiling widow. Eventually, fatigue overtook her curiosity, and she fell asleep on the couch, books scattered around her. Her dreams were troubled, filled with veiled figures and frozen smiles. The next morning, Emma arrived at the lab early, eager to continue her examination of the photograph. Thomas was already there, organizing supplies for the upcoming student practicums. "You look terrible," he said by way of greeting. "Late night? Research rabbit hole," Emma replied, setting up her workstation. "Take a look at this." She pulled up the enhanced image from yesterday, focusing on the area behind the veil. Thomas leaned in, squinting at the screen. Is she smiling? He asked incredulously. Emma nodded. That's what I spent half the night trying to understand. It goes against every convention of the time. Thomas frowned, studying the image. Could it be some kind of processing artifact? Or maybe damage to the original print? I considered that, but look at the consistency of the expression. That's definitely a smile, and not a small one either. Thomas straightened up, an odd expression crossing his face. You know, my grandmother used to talk about a scandal in this town. Something about a Blackwood funeral where the widow was suspected of being happy about her husband's death. Emma's interest piqued immediately. Really? What did she say? Thomas shrugged. Not much specific, just that there were rumors the widow had poisoned her husband, but nothing was ever proven. My grandmother was big on local gossip, but not so much on historical accuracy. Still, it's worth looking into, Emma said, already turning to her computer. What was the husband's name? The inscription only mentioned Blackwood funeral. I'm not sure, but the town records from that period are all digitized now. Should be easy enough to find a Blackwood death in September 1896. Emma spent the morning dividing her time between further examination of the photograph and searching through the digital archives. By lunchtime, she had found what she was looking for, an obituary in the local newspaper dated September 19, 1896. Listen to this, she called to Thomas, who was working across the lab. Prominent local businessman Nathaniel Blackwood, age 42, was laid to rest yesterday following a brief but severe illness. Mr. Blackwood, owner of Blackwood Timber and Railway Investments, leaves behind his wife of 3 years, the former Miss Eleanor Harker, and no children. Services were conducted at the family home with interment at Oakwood Cemetery. The community mourns the loss of one of its most industrious citizens. Brief but severe illness, Thomas repeated. That could certainly cover poisoning. Emma gave him a look. Let's not jump to conclusions. But I am interested in this Eleanor. 3 years of marriage, no children, and now sole heir to what was clearly a substantial business empire. Motive and opportunity, Thomas said with a grin. Should we start calling you Detective Clark? Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. I'm just curious about the historical context. A young widow with a mysterious smile hidden behind her veil. You have to admit it's intriguing. Absolutely. So what's our next step in this historical investigation? I want to find out more about Eleanor Harker Blackwood. What happened to her after the funeral? Did she take over the business? Remarry? Leave town? The university library has newspapers on microfilm going well into the 1920s, Thomas suggested. And the Historical Society might have personal papers or other photographs. Emma nodded. I'll head to the library this afternoon. Can you contact the Historical Society and see what they might have on the Blackwood or Harker families? Thomas agreed, and they spent the rest of the morning completing the conservation assessment of the funeral photograph and several others from the collection. Emma continued to be drawn back to the strange image of the smiling widow, feeling an inexplicable connection to the mysterious Eleanor Blackwood. After lunch, Emma headed to the university library's special collections department. The librarian, Dr. Rosalind Chen, was an old friend who had helped Emma with research on numerous occasions. Emma, what brings you to my dusty domain today? Dr. Chen greeted her warmly. Funeral photography and potential murder, Emma replied with a smile. The usual light reading. Dr. Chen laughed. You conservation types always did know how to have fun. What are you looking for specifically? Emma explained about the Blackwood funeral photograph and her interest in tracking Eleanor Blackwood's life after her husband's death. Dr. Chen led her to the microfilm section and helped her locate the local newspaper archives for the relevant period. If you're looking for society gossip as well as official news, don't forget to check the local happenings column, Dr. Chen advised. That's where all the thinly veiled speculation would appear. Emma spent hours scrolling through microfilm, taking notes on any mention of Eleanor Blackwood. The picture that emerged was fascinating. Within 6 months of Nathaniel's death, Eleanor had sold Blackwood Timber to a competitor, but maintained control of the railway investments, which she apparently managed with considerable skill. The local papers initially expressed surprise at a lady of gentle breeding involving herself in business matters, but soon shifted to reluctant admiration as her ventures proved successful. There was no mention of remarriage, though several articles hinted at gentlemen callers being seen at the Blackwood estate. By 1900, Eleanor had become one of the wealthiest individuals in the county, having expanded the railway investments into neighboring states. And then, in March 1901, just as suddenly as she had risen to prominence, Eleanor Blackwood disappeared from the public record. The last mention Emma could find was a small notice stating that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood has departed for an extended tour of Europe, having placed her business interests in the hands of trusted associates. Emma was making notes about this mysterious departure when her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Found something interesting at Historical Society. Can you meet me there before they close at 5? It was already 4:30. Emma quickly gathered her notes, thanked Dr. Chen, and hurried to her car. The Historical Society was on the other side of town, housed in what had once been the town's first library, a stately brick building with white columns. Thomas was waiting for her on the steps, an excited expression on his face. "What did you find?" Emma asked as she approached. "Not what, who?" Thomas replied cryptically, holding the door open for her. "There's someone you need to meet." Inside, Thomas led her to a small research room where an elderly woman sat surrounded by archival boxes. She looked to be in her early 90s, with carefully styled white hair and alert blue eyes that studied Emma with interest. "Emma, this is Mrs. Virginia Crawford." Thomas introduced them. "Mrs. Crawford, this is my colleague, Emma Clark, the photography conservator I mentioned." "Pleased to meet you," Emma said, extending her hand. Mrs. Crawford's grip was surprisingly firm. "Likewise, dear. Thomas tells me you've taken an interest in Eleanor Blackwood." "Yes, I'm researching a funeral photograph from 1896. Nathaniel's funeral." Mrs. Crawford nodded. "I never saw the photograph myself, but my mother spoke of it. Said there was something unsettling about it, though she couldn't say exactly what." Emma exchanged a glance with Thomas. "Mrs. Crawford, how do you know about the Blackwoods?" The elderly woman smiled. "Eleanor Blackwood was my great-aunt, my grandmother's sister." Emma felt a surge of excitement. A direct family connection was more than she had hoped for. "Mrs. Crawford, I can't tell you how valuable your insights might be to my research. What can you tell me about Eleanor and Nathaniel?" Mrs. Crawford gestured to the chairs across from her. "Sit down, dears. It's quite a story, and at my age I prefer my audience comfortable and close." As Emma and Thomas settled into their seats, a staff member from the Historical Society brought in a tea tray. "I took the liberty of arranging for refreshments," Thomas whispered to Emma. Mrs. Crawford agreed to stay late to talk with us. Once they each had a cup of tea, Mrs. Crawford began her story. Eleanor was born Eleanor Harker in 1876, which made her only 20 when she married Nathaniel Blackwood in 1893. Nathaniel was 22 years her senior, a widower whose first wife had died childless after 15 years of marriage. The match was considered advantageous for the Harker family, who had social standing but little money. For Nathaniel, the appeal was obvious. Eleanor was young, beautiful, and from a respected family. Mrs. Crawford sipped her tea before continuing. "According to my grandmother, the marriage was not a happy one. Nathaniel was controlling and had a violent temper. Eleanor was expected to be the perfect society wife, with no opinions or interests of her own. She wasn't even allowed to visit her family without Nathaniel's permission, which was rarely granted. That must have been difficult for her," Emma said, thinking of the smiling face behind the veil. "Indeed. My grandmother would occasionally visit the Blackwood home and would return upset by how subdued her once vivacious sister had become. There were rumors, of course, whispers of bruises hidden beneath high collars and long sleeves, of a broken wrist explained away as a carriage accident." Thomas leaned forward. "So when Nathaniel died suddenly, it was a blessing, though no one would say so publicly," Mrs. Crawford confirmed. "As for the nature of his death, the official cause was listed as gastric fever, but there were indeed rumors of poisoning. Arsenic was common in many household products then. Rat poison, certain cosmetics, even some medicines. It would have been easily accessible to Eleanor." "Were there any investigations?" Emma asked. "Not officially. Nathaniel was not well liked, despite his prominence in the community. His business practices were often ruthless, and he had made many enemies. Few people were interested in looking too closely at the circumstances of his death." Emma thought about the anxious expressions of the mourners in the photograph. In the funeral photo, the other attendees look uncomfortable, almost afraid. "Do you know who they might have been?" Mrs. Crawford considered this. The household staff would have been present. Nathaniel had a butler, a housekeeper, a cook, and several maids. His business associates as well, and perhaps a few relatives, though most of the Blackwood family lived further east. "Without seeing the photograph, I couldn't say for certain." "And what about Eleanor's life after Nathaniel's death?" Thomas asked. Ah, that's where the story becomes most interesting, Mrs. Crawford said, her eyes brightening. Eleanor shocked everyone by taking control of Nathaniel's businesses rather than selling everything and living as a wealthy widow. She had a natural talent for finance that no one had suspected. My grandmother said Eleanor had secretly read all of Nathaniel's business papers and books during their marriage, educating herself while pretending to be the docile wife he demanded. The newspaper accounts I found suggested she was quite successful, Emma noted. Extraordinarily so. Within a few years, she had doubled the value of the railway investments and established herself as a formidable businesswoman. This was virtually unheard of for a woman at that time, especially one so young. Of course, it caused no end of scandal. And then she suddenly left for Europe in 1901? Emma prompted. A shadow crossed Mrs. Crawford's face. That's the official story, yes. But according to my grandmother, Eleanor never went to Europe. The truth was far more complicated. Emma and Thomas exchanged glances. What happened to her? Emma asked. Mrs. Crawford set down her teacup with a slight tremor in her hand. In early 1901, one of Nathaniel's cousins from Boston came to town. He had been overseas during Nathaniel's illness and death and had only recently learned of his cousin's passing. This man, Edward Blackwood was his name, apparently had suspicions about Eleanor from the start. He began asking questions, speaking to the doctor who had attended Nathaniel, interviewing the household staff. He suspected murder, Thomas said. Yes, and he may have found evidence. No one knows exactly what he discovered, but my grandmother received a frantic letter from Eleanor in February 1901. In it, Eleanor confessed that she feared for her life and planned to disappear. She promised to contact my grandmother when it was safe, but she never did. So the Europe story was a cover, Emma mused. What do you think really happened to her? Mrs. Crawford shook her head sadly. My grandmother believed until her dying day that Eleanor had successfully escaped and was living under a new identity somewhere. But I've always wondered. Edward Blackwood took over Eleanor's business interests after her departure, claiming to be managing them during her absence. He eventually moved into the Blackwood estate and lived there until his death in 1927. You think he might have harmed her? Thomas asked gently. It's possible. There was a certain smugness in the way he positioned himself as the caretaker of Eleanor's fortune, or so my grandmother said, and the suddenness of Eleanor's disappearance always seemed suspicious. She didn't even say goodbye to my grandmother in person, which was out of character for their close relationship. Emma thought about the photograph, the hidden smile, the nervous mourners. Mrs. Crawford, would it be possible for you to visit our lab? I'd like to show you the funeral photograph. Perhaps you might recognize some of the mourners, or notice details that would be significant to a family member. Mrs. Crawford nodded. I'd be happy to, though my eyesight isn't what it once was. Would tomorrow morning be convenient? My nurse drives me on Thursdays. They arranged to meet at the conservation lab at 10 a.m. the following day. As they were preparing to leave, Mrs. Crawford reached into one of the archival boxes and pulled out a small leather-bound book.
This was my grandmother's diary from that period, she said, handing it to Emma. The Historical Society has been kind enough to let me keep it while I work on my family history. I've marked the entries that mention Eleanor. Perhaps they will help with your research. Emma accepted the diary with careful hands. This is incredibly generous, Mrs. Crawford. I'll take excellent care of it. I know you will, dear. And please, call me Virginia.
Anyone interested in uncovering the truth about Eleanor is a friend to me. That evening, Emma sat in her apartment. Virginia Crawford's grandmother's diary opened before her. The entries were written in a flowing script, occasionally difficult to decipher but compelling in their intimacy. Emma focused on the marked entries, which spanned from 1893, when Eleanor married Nathaniel, to 1901, when she disappeared. The early entries confirmed what Virginia had told them: Eleanor's growing unhappiness in her marriage, Nathaniel's controlling behavior, the isolation from her family. One entry from 1895 was particularly disturbing. Visited Eleanor today after receiving a cryptic note. Found her with her arm in a sling, claiming to have fallen down the stairs. Her maid Catherine gave me a look that spoke volumes. When Nathaniel stepped out, Eleanor broke down in tears, saying she fears she cannot endure much more. I suggested she leave him, come home to us, but she says N has threatened to ruin Father financially if she ever attempts to leave. I feel helpless to aid my beloved sister. The entries following Nathaniel's death in 1896 showed a remarkable transformation in Eleanor. Attended N's funeral today. Despite the solemn occasion, I could sense E's relief beneath her heavy veil. She pressed my hand when no one was looking and whispered that she would be free now. I pray this is true. And a month later, E has astonished everyone by announcing she will not sell N's businesses but instead manage them herself. Mother is scandalized, father concerned, but I am proud of her courage. She confided that she has been studying N's business papers in secret for years and understands his operations better than his own managers. I believe her. E always had a quick mind, though our parents saw no value in educating daughters beyond social graces. The diary tracked Eleanor's rise in the business world, her growing confidence, and the gradual healing of the psychological wounds from her marriage. There were hints of romantic interests, but nothing serious. Eleanor seemed focused on establishing her independence. Then came the entries from early 1901, which took on an increasingly worried tone. E visited today, greatly agitated. N. His cousin Edward has been making inquiries about N's death. E fears he suspects the truth. I told her no one could prove anything after all this time, but she is not reassured. And 2 weeks later, received letter from E today. She plans to disappear, says it is the only way to be safe from Edward. She has made arrangements to transfer funds to a bank in Chicago under a different name. She promises to contact me when she is settled, but I fear for her safety. Edward watches her house, follows her in town. She must be very careful. The final entry about Eleanor was dated March 12, 1901. No word from E since her disappearance 2 weeks ago. Edward Blackwood is telling everyone she has gone to Europe and left him in charge of her affairs. I do not believe this for a moment. I visited the Blackwood house today on the pretense of collecting some books E had borrowed. The staff seemed nervous, especially Catherine, who has been with E since her marriage. When I managed a private word with her, Catherine would say only that Mrs. Blackwood had left suddenly one night with a small bag. She looked frightened and would say no more. I am increasingly concerned that harm has come to my sister. Emma closed the diary, her mind racing with possibilities. The historical record showed that Eleanor Blackwood had officially departed for Europe, but her sister clearly believed otherwise. Had Eleanor successfully escaped Edward's suspicions and established a new life elsewhere? Or had something more sinister occurred? The hidden smile in the funeral photograph now seemed even more significant. If Eleanor had indeed been responsible for Nathaniel's death, that smile represented her first moment of freedom after years of abuse, a freedom she had orchestrated herself. Emma turned to her computer and began searching for information on Edward Blackwood. There wasn't much in the online historical records, but she did find mentions of him in Boston newspapers from the 1890s. He had been a business partner in Nathaniel's early ventures before having a falling out around 1890. After that, he had spent several years in Europe before returning to America in late 1900, just months before Eleanor's disappearance. Emma sent a text to Thomas sharing what she had learned from the diary and her initial research on Edward. His reply came quickly. This keeps getting more interesting. I've been looking into that locked casket detail you noticed. Apparently it wasn't common practice unless there was concern about grave robbing or if the contents needed to be secured for some other reason. Emma frowned at his cryptic message. What other reason? She texted back. To prevent it from being opened at the funeral or before burial. Think about it. If Nathaniel was poisoned, an autopsy might have revealed it. A locked casket could prevent any last-minute examination. It was a disturbing thought, but it made a certain sense. If Eleanor had poisoned her abusive husband, she would have wanted to ensure there was no investigation. A locked casket, a quick burial, and her position as the grieving widow would have helped accomplish that. Emma's phone rang. Thomas again. I had another thought, he said when she answered. What if we tried to enhance more of the photograph? Not just the veil, but the mourners' faces, the details of the room, everything. There might be other clues we're missing. Good idea, Emma agreed. I'll start on that in the morning before Virginia arrives. And Thomas, thank you for finding her. This family connection adds a whole new dimension to our understanding. Happy to help. See you tomorrow. Emma spent a restless night, her dreams filled with veiled women and locked caskets. She arrived at the lab early the next morning, determined to extract every possible detail from the Blackwood funeral photograph before Virginia's visit. Using the lab's advanced imaging software, Emma began methodically enhancing different sections of the photograph. She started with the mourners, trying to identify each face clearly enough to potentially match them with names from historical records. The enhanced images revealed subtle details she had missed before. One woman standing near the back wore a maid's uniform, partially hidden by her mourning shawl. This might be Catherine, the maid mentioned in the diary. An older couple who shared some facial features with the veiled Eleanor, based on other Harker family photographs Emma had found in the archives, were likely her parents. Most interesting was a man standing slightly apart from the others, the same one whose fearful expression had caught Emma's attention initially. Enhanced imaging showed that he was clutching what appeared to be a medical bag. The local doctor, perhaps? And if so, why did he look so afraid? Emma moved on to the room itself, enhancing the background details. The funeral was held in what appeared to be the Blackwood home's formal parlor. Visible in the background was a large portrait of a stern-looking man who, based on his clothing and apparent age, was likely Nathaniel himself. There was also a small table with what looked like medication bottles partially visible behind a floral arrangement. Just as Emma was about to enhance that section further, Thomas arrived with Virginia Crawford. The elderly woman moved slowly with the aid of a cane, accompanied by a nurse who helped her to a chair Emma had prepared near the examination table. "Good morning, Virginia." Emma greeted her. "Thank you for coming. I've been working on enhancing details in the photograph." Virginia nodded, her eyes bright with interest. "I'm eager to see this infamous funeral portrait. My grandmother mentioned it many times, though as I said, she never showed it to me." Emma carefully set up the original photograph where Virginia could see it, and then positioned her computer screen to show the enhanced images. Virginia studied the original first, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, that's the Blackwood parlor," she confirmed. "And there are my grandparents in the back row." My grandmother would have been 28 then, just 2 years younger than Eleanor. She pointed to the couple Emma had identified earlier. "And that's Catherine, Eleanor's lady's maid. She was devoted to Eleanor, had been with her since before the marriage. My grandmother tried to find her after Eleanor disappeared, but she had left her position at the Blackwood house without notice or forwarding address." "What about this man?" Emma asked, pointing to the fearful-looking man with the medical bag. "Could he be the family doctor?" Virginia leaned closer, squinting slightly. "Yes, that's Dr. Morris. He attended both Nathaniel during his illness and my grandfather in his later years. A nervous man, as I recall from my childhood. He was always wiping his forehead with a handkerchief." Emma brought up the enhanced image of the veiled widow on her computer. "Virginia, I need to show you something unusual we discovered. When we enhanced the image to see through the veil, we found that Eleanor appears to be smiling." Virginia didn't seem surprised. "May I see?" Emma turned the screen toward her. Virginia studied the enhanced image of the smiling face behind the veil, nodding slowly. "Yes, that would be consistent with what my grandmother believed," she said quietly. Eleanor had endured years of abuse at Nathaniel's hands. His death, however it came about, would have been a liberation for her. "Do you believe she poisoned him?" Thomas asked directly. Virginia met his gaze steadily. "I believe Eleanor did what was necessary to survive. Whether that included hastening Nathaniel's end, I cannot say with certainty, but I would not condemn her if she did." Emma turned the conversation to the locked casket she had noticed. Was there any particular reason Nathaniel's casket would have been locked? A slight smile crossed Virginia's face. "Interesting that you noticed that detail. According to my grandmother, there was some disagreement about the cause of Nathaniel's death. Dr. Morris initially wrote unknown gastric ailment on the death certificate, but there was pressure from Nathaniel's business manager to list it simply as natural causes. There was no autopsy performed, which was unusual for a sudden death of someone of Nathaniel's standing, and the locked casket would have prevented any later examination," Emma concluded. Virginia nodded. "Precisely. Though who ordered it locked? Eleanor, Dr. Morris, or someone else? I don't know." They spent the next hour going through the enhanced images, with Virginia identifying as many of the mourners as she could remember from family stories. Most were business associates of Nathaniel's or household staff. One, however, caught Virginia's attention. "This man here, partially hidden behind the floral arrangement. I don't recognize him, but there's something familiar about his features." Emma enhanced the image further, bringing the man's face into clearer focus. He was younger than most of the other mourners, perhaps in his 30s, with sharp features and a watchful expression. "He bears a resemblance to Nathaniel," Virginia said slowly. "Could he be a family member? Perhaps even Edward Blackwood?" Emma and Thomas exchanged glances. "I thought Edward didn't return from Europe until 1900, Emma said. "That's what the newspaper accounts indicated," Virginia confirmed. But family stories aren't always accurate, and newspapers even less so. If Edward was already harboring suspicions about Eleanor, he might have returned secretly for the funeral to observe her. The possibility added a new layer to the mystery. If Edward had been present at the funeral, had he seen something that later fueled his suspicions? Perhaps even glimpsed Eleanor's smile behind her veil. Virginia's nurse reminded her that they had another appointment, and they reluctantly concluded their examination of the photograph. Before leaving, Virginia turned to Emma with a serious expression. "There's one more place you might look for answers," she said. "The Blackwood Mausoleum at Oakwood Cemetery. Nathaniel was interred there, and according to my grandmother, Eleanor had a hidden compartment built into her own future resting place within the mausoleum. Supposedly, she kept important papers there, papers she didn't want found in the house." "A hidden compartment in a mausoleum?" Thomas repeated. "That's rather gothic." Virginia smiled. Eleanor had a flair for the dramatic by all accounts, and a mausoleum would be one place Nathaniel would never have looked during his lifetime. After his death, it would have seemed a fitting place to hide secrets she wanted kept even from her own household staff. After Virginia left, Emma and Thomas discussed this new information. "Do you think it's worth checking out the mausoleum?" Thomas asked. "Absolutely," Emma replied. "If Eleanor left any record of what really happened, either with Nathaniel's death or her own disappearance, that hidden compartment might be the only place it still exists." "Oakwood Cemetery is still active," Thomas noted. "We should be able to visit during regular hours, though accessing a private mausoleum might be tricky. Virginia might be able to help with that. As a family member, she would have a legitimate reason to visit the Blackwood Mausoleum." Emma sent a text to Virginia's nurse, asking if Virginia would be willing to help them gain access to the mausoleum. The response came quickly. Virginia would be happy to make arrangements, and suggested they meet at Oakwood Cemetery the following afternoon. While waiting for confirmation of their cemetery visit, Emma continued to research Edward Blackwood. There wasn't much to find in the digital archives, but a visit to the town's historical newspaper office yielded more information. Edward had indeed been in Europe during the early 1890s, but had returned to Boston by 1895. There was a brief mention of him visiting Westfield in the summer of 1896, just months before Nathaniel's death, though no indication that he had stayed for the funeral. After Nathaniel's death, Edward had made no public claim to the Blackwood businesses, apparently content to remain in Boston with his own ventures. It wasn't until early 1901 that he reappeared in Westfield, supposedly at Eleanor's invitation to discuss business matters, and then, within weeks of his arrival, Eleanor had departed for Europe, leaving Edward in control of her substantial assets. Emma found the announcement of Edward's takeover of the Blackwood businesses in the March 15, 1901 edition of the local paper. "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, widow of the late Nathaniel Blackwood, has departed for an extended tour of the continent to restore her health after recent nervous exhaustion. During her absence, which is expected to last several years, Mr. Edward Blackwood, cousin to the late Mr. Blackwood, will manage the considerable Blackwood interests." Mr. E. Blackwood expressed his gratitude for Mrs. Blackwood's trust and assured this paper that all business matters would be conducted in accordance with her explicit instructions until her return. The phrase nervous exhaustion stood out to Emma. It was a common euphemism of the time, often used to explain away everything from genuine mental health issues to inconvenient behavior in women. Had Eleanor truly been suffering from some kind of breakdown? Or was this another fabrication to explain her sudden disappearance? Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Virginia's nurse. The cemetery visit was arranged for 2 p.m. the following day. Virginia had contacted the cemetery administration and, as a Blackwood descendant, had received permission to access the family mausoleum. That night, Emma dreamed of Eleanor Blackwood. In the dream, the veiled widow stood by a casket, but when she lifted her veil, her face was Emma's own. She woke with a start, unsettled by the identification her subconscious had made between herself and Eleanor. The next day dawned gray and misty, a fitting atmosphere for a cemetery visit. Emma and Thomas met Virginia at the gates of Oakwood Cemetery, where the administrator was waiting to escort them to the Blackwood Mausoleum. Oakwood was a typical Victorian-era cemetery, with winding paths, mature trees, and a mix of ornate monuments and simple headstones. The Blackwood Mausoleum stood on a small rise in the oldest section of the cemetery, a neoclassical structure of pale granite with a bronze door turning green with verdigris. The administrator unlocked the heavy door, which opened with a protesting creak. "Take your time, Mrs. Crawford," he said respectfully. "I'll wait by the main path to give you privacy with your family." The interior of the mausoleum was cool and dim, light filtering through a small stained glass window in the rear wall. 6 wall crypts lined the sides, 3 on each wall, with inscribed marble plates identifying the occupants. Nathaniel's was easily identifiable, his name, birth, and death dates engraved in formal script. Beside his was a plate for Eleanor, with her birth date but no death date, an empty crypt waiting for a body that had never been placed there. "According to my grandmother," Virginia said quietly, "the hidden compartment is behind Eleanor's crypt plate. There should be a mechanism to open it without disturbing the plate itself." Emma examined the marble plate carefully, looking for any unusual features. The craftsmanship was excellent, the edges meeting the surrounding stone with precision. There was a small decorative carving at each corner, stylized lilies, a common funerary motif. "May I?" Thomas asked, indicating that he wanted to touch the plate. Virginia nodded, and Thomas ran his fingers along the carved lilies. At the bottom right corner, he pressed gently on the center of the flower, and they heard a faint click. The right edge of the marble plate recessed slightly. "Clever," Emma murmured as Thomas carefully pulled the plate forward. Behind it was not the empty crypt one would expect, but a shallow compartment containing a metal box about the size of a large book. Thomas carefully removed the box and set it on a small stone shelf beneath the stained glass window. The box was locked, a simple key lock that had corroded over time. "I didn't think to bring tools," Emma said, frowning at the lock. "Allow me," Virginia said, opening her handbag. She removed a small key on an antique silver chain. "My grandmother gave me this before she died. She said it was Eleanor's and might open doors to the past one day. I've carried it for 60 years without knowing what it might open." With slightly trembling hands, Virginia inserted the key into the lock. It turned with difficulty, the mechanism stiff with age, but eventually yielded with a rusty click. Inside the box were several items: a small leather-bound journal, a folded document that appeared to be a bank certificate, a man's pocket watch, and a small glass vial containing traces of a white powder. "Are we okay with opening these?" Thomas asked, looking to Virginia. "They're your family's personal effects." Virginia nodded firmly. "Eleanor's story deserves to be known. Too long has she been merely a footnote in Blackwood history, her life and likely her death controlled by the men around her. Please proceed." Emma carefully opened the journal first. The handwriting matched the samples of Eleanor's writing she had seen in Virginia's grandmother's diary, a confident, flowing script. The entries began in January 1896, 8 months before Nathaniel's death, and continued until March 1901, the time of Eleanor's disappearance. "This may take some time to read properly," Emma said. "Should we take these items back to the lab for proper examination?" Virginia considered this. "Yes, I think that would be wise. The cemetery will be closing soon, and these documents deserve careful handling and reading." They carefully returned the box to Virginia's handbag. As the rightful family heir, she was the appropriate custodian, and replaced the marble plate in its original position. The mechanism clicked as it locked back into place, the mausoleum once again keeping its secrets hidden from casual observers. Back at the conservation lab, Emma prepared a clean workspace for examining the contents of Eleanor's hidden box. She wore cotton gloves to protect the documents from the oils on her skin and arranged proper lighting for reading the faded ink. Virginia sat nearby, with Thomas setting up a digital camera to document each page as they examined it. The journal was their primary focus. Eleanor's own words might finally reveal the truth about what had happened in the Blackwood household. The earliest entries confirmed what they had already surmised. Nathaniel was abusive, controlling Eleanor's every move and subjecting her to both physical violence and psychological torment. Eleanor wrote of her growing desperation and her fear that Nathaniel would eventually kill her, either intentionally in a rage or through the cumulative damage of his corrections, as he called his physical abuse. In April 1896, the entries took a new turn. "I have made a friend in the most unexpected quarter. Dr. Morris, who comes to treat my latest accident, knows the truth. Today, as he bandaged my broken finger, he looked me in the eye and said, 'This was no fall down the stairs, Mrs. Blackwood.' I was terrified at first, thinking he would tell Nathaniel I had spoken against him. Instead, the good doctor told me he has seen too many wives with similar accidents and could no longer pretend ignorance. He offered me sleeping powders for Nathaniel to give me peaceful nights free from his attentions. I accepted gratefully." Several entries later, Eleanor wrote, The sleeping powders are a blessing. For the first time in years, I have hours to myself in the evenings while Nathaniel slumbers heavily in his chair before the fire. I have been using this time to educate myself, reading his business papers and books on finance and railway management. Knowledge is its own form of power, one Nathaniel would never suspect me of seeking. By July, the entries became more troubling. Dr. Morris visited again today, ostensibly to check on my healing wrist. When we were alone, he asked how I was faring with the sleeping powders. I admitted they have been a salvation. Then he asked in a very careful way whether I had considered a more permanent solution to my situation. He did not speak plainly, but his meaning was clear enough. He left a small vial, saying only that it would bring peace if added to Nathaniel's evening brandy, a little more each night over the course of a week. I have hidden it in my sewing box. I do not know if I have the courage to use it, but I find comfort in knowing it exists. Emma glanced at the small vial they had found in the box. Traces of white powder still clung to the inside of the glass. Without chemical analysis, there was no way to know for certain what it contained, but, given the context, arsenic seemed likely. The next significant entry came in early September 1896. It is done. I have administered the powder as Dr. Morris instructed, a little more each evening. Nathaniel complained of stomach pains this morning and has taken to his bed. Dr. Morris has been summoned. When he arrived, he gave me a knowing look but said nothing. He told the servants that Nathaniel appears to be suffering from a gastric fever and prescribed bed rest and bland foods. Nathaniel refused the medicine Dr. Morris offered, suspicious as always. It matters not. The process has begun and cannot be reversed now. The entry for September 17, 1896, the day before the funeral, was brief but revealing. Nathaniel passed this morning. Dr. Morris has signed the death certificate citing gastric fever as the cause. There will be no autopsy. I made sure the casket was ordered with a lock, citing Nathaniel's fear of grave robbers as the reason. The funeral is tomorrow. I must appear appropriately devastated, though inside I feel only an overwhelming sense of freedom. For the first time in 3 years, I will sleep without fear tonight. There was no entry for the day of the funeral itself, but the next day, Eleanor wrote, "The funeral went as planned. I maintained my composure throughout, hidden behind my veil. Only my sister seemed to sense my true feelings, squeezing my hand in understanding when no one was looking. Dr. Morris appeared nervous, as well he might. He is as complicit in this as I am, though I bear the greater responsibility. I do not regret what I have done. 3 days ago, Nathaniel broke 2 of my ribs in a rage over a meal he found unsatisfactory. It was only a matter of time before he killed me. I chose to live." The journal continued, documenting Eleanor's assumption of control over Nathaniel's businesses, her growing confidence, and her success in the male-dominated business world. There were references to occasional social events, but Eleanor seemed focused primarily on establishing her financial independence and security. Then, in January 1901, the tone of the entries changed dramatically. Edward Blackwood has come to town, asking questions about Nathaniel's death. He claims to have received a letter from someone in the household suggesting Nathaniel was poisoned. I suspect Catherine. She has been distant lately, ever since I refused to increase her wages. Edward has been speaking with Dr. Morris as well. The doctor sent me a note warning me that Edward is pressing him for details about Nathaniel's final illness. I fear the doctor may break under pressure. The entries became increasingly frantic over the next few weeks as Eleanor documented Edward's investigation and her growing fear. The final entry, dated March 1, 1901, read, "Dr. Morris is dead, found in his office with an empty laudanum bottle beside him. The official ruling is suicide, but I suspect Edward's hand in this. Before he died, Morris sent me a note confessing that he had told Edward everything under threat of exposure for other mercy killings he had facilitated over the years. I am now in grave danger. Edward has no proof that would stand in court, but he doesn't need the law to enact revenge for his cousin. I have made arrangements to disappear. I have established a new identity as Margaret Wilson in Chicago, with sufficient funds transferred to begin a new life. This will be my final entry in this journal. I leave it here, in the one place Edward would never think to look, along with the evidence of my crime. Perhaps someday, someone will find it and understand that I did what was necessary to survive. To whoever reads this, do not judge me harshly. Until you have lived in fear for years, you cannot know what desperate measures seem reasonable for the sake of freedom. Attached to the final page was a small newspaper clipping dated March 5, 1901, apparently added later. Dr. James Morris, respected local physician, was laid to rest yesterday following his tragic suicide last week. Dr. Morris had reportedly been suffering from melancholia for some time, according to colleagues. Emma, Thomas, and Virginia sat in silence for several moments after reading the final entry. The journal had confirmed their suspicions about Nathaniel's death and added the disturbing suggestion that Dr. Morris's supposed suicide may have actually been murder committed by Edward Blackwood. So Eleanor did escape to Chicago, Thomas said finally. At least, that was her plan. Virginia nodded slowly. It seemed so. But did she make it? And what happened to her afterward? There's still a piece of the puzzle missing. Emma carefully unfolded the bank certificate they had found in the box. It was indeed for a Chicago bank, documenting a deposit of $50,000, a substantial sum in 1901 in the name of Margaret Wilson. The date on the certificate was February 20th, 1901, suggesting Eleanor had been planning her escape for some time before she actually disappeared. And the pocket watch? Thomas asked, gesturing to the gold timepiece they had also found in the box. Virginia picked it up carefully. It was Nathaniel's. My grandmother mentioned it. He was never without it. For Eleanor to have it, she must have taken it either before or immediately after his death. Emma examined the watch. It was a fine piece with an engraved case bearing the Blackwood family crest. When she opened it, she found an inscription inside. To Nathaniel, may your time be prosperous, Father. Why would she keep this? Emma wondered aloud. If she was trying to escape her past, why take a memento of her abuser? Perhaps as proof of his death, Thomas suggested, or as a reminder of what she had overcome, or as evidence, Virginia said quietly. If she ever needed to prove who she had been before becoming Margaret Wilson, the watch would be an identifiable Blackwood family item. They continued to examine the contents of the box, but found no definitive evidence of what had happened to Eleanor after she fled to Chicago. The trail seemed to end with her planned escape. I have a contact at the Chicago Historical Society, Thomas said. I could ask them to search for records of a Margaret Wilson appearing in Chicago in 1901. That would be helpful, Virginia agreed. I would very much like to know if my great-aunt succeeded in her escape and managed to build a new life for herself. As they were carefully repacking the items, Emma's phone rang. It was Mrs. Winters, the realtor handling the Blackwood estate sale. Ms. Clark, I'm sorry to bother you, but something unusual has come up at the Blackwood house. During final preparations for tomorrow's estate sale, we found a hidden compartment in the master bedroom. It contains what appears to be old photographs and documents. Given your expertise, I wondered if you might come take a look before we decide what to do with them. Emma agreed immediately, explaining the situation to Thomas and Virginia after hanging up. This could be another piece of the puzzle, she said. Would you like to come with me to the Blackwood house? Both agreed enthusiastically, and they carefully packed Eleanor's box for Virginia to take home for safekeeping. The conservation work on the funeral photograph was complete, but Emma felt increasingly invested in uncovering the full story of Eleanor Blackwood. The Blackwood estate was a large Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, set back from the road behind mature oak trees. Its architectural details, ornate gables, a wraparound porch, and a distinctive turret on one corner, marked it as the home of a wealthy family from the late 19th century. Despite decades of different occupants, it was still known locally as the Blackwood House. Mrs. Winters met them at the door, clearly surprised by Virginia's presence but quickly adapting when Emma explained she was a Blackwood descendant. The realtor led them upstairs to the master bedroom, a large corner room with tall windows and faded floral wallpaper. The estate clearance crew was removing the wardrobe when they noticed something odd about the wall behind it, Mrs. Winters explained, pointing to a large piece of furniture that had been pulled away from the wall. There's a small door built into the wainscoting. Indeed, a panel approximately 2 feet square was visible in the wall, with a small, discreet keyhole. It would have been completely hidden by the wardrobe when it was in its usual position. Do you have a key? Emma asked. Mrs. Winters shook her head. No, but the panel is loose. The lock seems to have deteriorated over time. With a little effort, we can open it without a key. Thomas carefully examined the panel, then applied gentle pressure to the top edge. With a protesting creak, it swung open, revealing a small compartment containing a metal box, similar to the one they had found in the mausoleum, though larger. Emma carefully removed the box and placed it on a nearby table. Unlike the mausoleum box, this one was not locked. Inside, they found several photographs, letters tied with faded ribbon. and a leather-bound book that appeared to be another journal. The photographs were primarily cabinet cards and larger format portraits, all featuring the same woman at different ages. The earliest showed a young woman in her 20s, dressed in the fashion of the 1890s, clearly Eleanor as a young bride. The later images showed the same woman in her 30s and 40s, in styles from the early 1900s to around 1920, but identified on the back as Margaret Wilson. She did make it to Chicago, Virginia breathed, examining the photographs, and survived for at least 20 years after her escape. The journal confirmed this. It began in March 1901 with an entry dated just days after Eleanor's disappearance from Westfield. I have arrived safely in Chicago and taken rooms in a respectable boarding house on Michigan Avenue. The landlady asked few questions, accepting my story of being a widow seeking a fresh start in the city. My funds are secure in the bank, and I have begun to explore investment opportunities. I must be cautious. Edward has connections in Chicago's business world, and while he would not know to look for Margaret Wilson, I cannot risk being recognized. The journal documented Eleanor's, now Margaret's, new life, her careful investments, her gradually expanding social circle, and her eventual purchase of a small but elegant house in a good neighborhood. There were mentions of friends, cultural events, and even a few romantic interests, though she never remarried. Then, in an entry from October 1927, came a startling revelation. News reached me today that Edward Blackwood has died. After all these years of looking over my shoulder, I can finally breathe freely. The newspaper obituary states he died of heart failure at the Blackwood estate in Westfield. He was found in Nathaniel's old study, slumped over the desk. There is a certain poetry to that end. The same room where Nathaniel would drink his brandy each evening while I added Dr. Morris's powder. I wonder if Edward ever suspected that room held such significance. With his death, I am truly free at last. There is no one left who knows who Margaret Wilson once was. The final entry in the journal was dated June 15, 1942. I am an old woman now, approaching my 70th year. My health is failing, and I know I have not many years left. I have lived a good life as Margaret Wilson, far better than I could have hoped for during those dark years with Nathaniel. I have no regrets about the choices I made, though I have carried the weight of them all these years. My will is prepared, leaving my modest estate to the Chicago Women's Aid Society, which helps women escape abusive situations. It seems a fitting legacy. This journal, along with the one hidden in the mausoleum and the box of photographs I keep in my secret compartment, will tell my true story when I am gone. Whether anyone ever finds all the pieces and assembles them, I cannot know. Perhaps it is better if my secrets die with me. Yet a part of me hopes that someday, someone will understand the full truth of Eleanor Blackwood and Margaret Wilson, two women who were really one, a survivor who refused to remain a victim. The journal ended there. Among the other papers in the box was a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune dated August 3, 1942. Wilson Margaret died peacefully at home July 30, 1942, age 66 years. A generous benefactor to many Chicago charities, Miss Wilson will be remembered for her contributions to the Women's Aid Society and the Children's Hospital. Private interment has taken place at Graceland Cemetery. No flowers by request. Virginia wiped tears from her eyes as Emma finished reading the obituary aloud. She survived, the elderly woman said softly. She built a new life for herself and lived to old age. My grandmother never knew what happened to her beloved sister. But how did these items end up back at the Blackwood house? Thomas wondered. If Eleanor, Margaret, died in Chicago, how did her personal effects return to Westfield? Emma examined the box more carefully and found a folded letter at the bottom, dated September 1942, and addressed to the current occupant of the Blackwood estate, Westfield. The letter was signed by a Martha Collins, who identified herself as Margaret Wilson's housekeeper and friend of many years. Per Miss Wilson's explicit instructions to be carried out after her death, I am sending this box to the Blackwood house. She directed that it should be hidden in a compartment behind the wardrobe in the master bedroom, which she described in detail. She said there was a certain symmetry in returning her story to where it began. Miss Wilson spoke little of her past, but in her final days she shared with me that she had once lived in this house under a different name and had fled due to dangerous circumstances. She asked that I place this advertisement in the Westfield Gazette after sending this box. Attached to the letter was a newspaper clipping from the Westfield Gazette, dated October 1942. To the family of Eleanor Harker Blackwood, the bird has flown home at last. September 18, 1896, July 30, 1942. May she finally rest in peace. The advertisement was a message to my grandmother. Virginia realized. September 18, 1896 was the date of Nathaniel's funeral, the beginning of Eleanor's freedom. July 30, 1942 was the date of her death as Margaret Wilson. She was telling her sister that she had lived a full life and died peacefully. But your grandmother never saw the hidden box with the explanation, Emma said, understanding dawning. The message in the newspaper would have been cryptic without the context these journals provide. Virginia nodded sadly. My grandmother died in 1945. She may have seen the advertisement but not understood its full meaning. She always believed Eleanor had met with foul play at Edward's hands. She never knew her sister had escaped and thrived. Mrs. Winters, who had been listening to their discoveries with growing interest, spoke up. This is all fascinating, but what should we do with these items? The estate sale is tomorrow. Virginia straightened in her chair, a determined look on her face. These items rightfully belong to me as Eleanor's closest living relative. I would like to take them, along with any other Blackwood family photographs and documents you found in the house. Mrs. Winters agreed readily, seemingly relieved to have a straightforward solution to this unexpected discovery. They spent the next hour gathering all the Blackwood family items that had been set aside for the estate sale, with Emma providing advice on proper handling and storage. As they prepared to leave, Virginia turned to Emma with a thoughtful expression. You know, Eleanor's story deserves to be told, not just for her sake, but for all the women who have found themselves in similar situations across time. Would you be interested in helping me document this properly? Perhaps an exhibit at the Historical Society, or even a small book? Emma smiled, thinking of how this project had begun with a simple funeral photograph and led to uncovering a remarkable woman's secret life. I'd be honored to help, Virginia. Eleanor's journey from victim to survivor is powerful, a testament to her courage and resilience. And the funeral photograph that started all this? Thomas asked. What should we do with that? I think, Virginia said slowly, that it should be displayed prominently in whatever form our project takes. That hidden smile behind the veil was Eleanor's first moment of true freedom, the beginning of her journey to become Margaret Wilson. It's not a macabre detail, but a symbol of survival and hope. As they left the Blackwood house for the last time, Emma glanced back at the imposing Victorian structure. For decades, it had held secrets within its walls, a hidden compartment, a concealed journal, the truth about a woman who had refused to remain a victim. Tomorrow, new owners would begin to make their own history there, unaware of the remarkable story that had unfolded within those rooms more than a century ago. The funeral photograph would continue to exist, preserving that moment when a veiled widow stood beside her husband's casket, her face hidden from the world. Except now, thanks to modern technology and persistent research, the truth behind that veil had finally been revealed. The solemn image had a new meaning now, not just a record of death, but a testament to one woman's determination to live.